But in men's work, learning to trust that inner sense of knowing is crucial. Tim, you led 2 practices this week, the sharing circle and the embodiment circle, and both focused around the theme of intuition. Can you share a little bit about the nature of these 2 circles, what they were, and the intentions behind them?
Absolutely. I wanted to talk about intuition because it was a foundational tool in the coaching program that I was trained in shortly after pandemic. That it was a conscious tool used in congruence with presence. I would almost say that you can't really access your intuition fully if you're not present, in service of a greater good. And in this particular case, it was in coaching another person and trying to help them or support them in the pursuit of their own healing and discovery. So the sharing circle and then the embodiment circle were geared around asking the men how they felt about their intuition, what they thought intuition was, and how they worked with it and their challenges around it, and then giving them an opportunity to do some physical practice that might allow them an access or an insight into it that they may not otherwise have. One of the things I wanted to talk about primarily was, I think, and from my own personal experience, intuition was always a thing that was characterized as something for women, which is a sentence I don't like saying with the framework I have now. But when I think about the young boy, like, oh, women have emotions and women have intuition. A woman's intuition, that's a phrase we've all heard. Even in the circle on Monday, I think we heard someone talk about how women just seem to have this access to intuition that was unavailable to the man who was speaking. And what I wanted to bring into awareness was this idea that intuition, like so many things, are a human experience available to all of us if we are human, and that we can work with it, recognize it, deepen it, but we have to become aware of it, and we have to destigmatize it, meaning if you have an intuitive ping, but you also think of it as something only a woman should have, and therefore it chips away at your masculinity or your sense of your own masculinity, are you going to push it away or ignore it or judge it? Or will you allow yourself to use it and utilize it and benefit from it? I have seen through my work that men can benefit from deepening and utilizing their intuition. They need a little bit of know-how, a little bit of understanding, and I have seen a little bit of permission. And luckily for me, I've had people give me permission. And so if I can return the favor, giving other people permission, other men permission to access their intuition benefits everyone from what I've observed. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I want to pause briefly on the assumption that it sounds like there was somebody in circle, and even in some of the things that you were saying, that like there's an association or an assumption that like some people are born with intuition and some people aren't. And so like I think we take a step back and we start to figure out, okay, like what is intuition? How are we going to define it today? To then be able to say, is this something that some people naturally have and that other people have to train in? So let's start with, what is intuition? And, how would you define intuition as a form of knowing, and how does it differ from sensing?
I would say that intuition is a deep felt sense of knowing, and that it often does not exist in the realm of logic. So I think one of the reasons why men's embodiment work and practice is so important is because I believe that intuition is largely connected to our whole self. So we've talked about men today being accustomed to staying in their heads, being very head-centric, logic, rationality, reason, and divorcing themselves from other parts of them, like their heart, their gut, their cock, primal energy. And I believe that a lot of that other part of us that we sometimes suppress or ignore can be a real source of intuition. So for me, intuition is this sense, this knowing that comes from our wholeness.
If I'm hearing correctly, it's I know that I know, but I don't know why I know, right? There's not always a rationale for why I know something.
Totally. And I think when I think about intuition, I often think about it as this evolving thing. So, you talked about sensing, and I'm not entirely sure how it's different, but especially with people that I'm deeply familiar, close friends, and people that I've spent a lot of time with, I can have a sense, oh, something's up. I don't know what's up, and I don't know why it's up, but I know that it's up, and there's something, whether it's in my gut or my heart, in my throat, that is alerting me something's not the same. I think that is a felt sense intuition.
When I think of sense, I think of the primary senses of I can taste something, I can touch something, I can see something, I can hear something, I can think something, right? So like that's what I mean by sensing, is that like I can walk into a room and I can see something, right? But my intuition is not reliant necessarily on a sense for me to know something.
Yes, and I think that our intuition is probably deeply connected to our senses. So, when my face was paralyzed after my brain surgery, I experienced the world in a very interesting way. Not a comfortable way, not one that I would want to repeat if I could choose. But I realized, we are sending messages with our body language and our facial expressions all the time. And we are also pretty adept at looking for them, right? And so in this moment, and I won't go into the details of like all of it, but I remember like half of my face was paralyzed for a time, and the world was responding to me in like very odd ways. And of course I looked wild in that moment too, because I had an eye patch on and whatever. But I started to realize, I'm like, I'm sending all these messages, and they are mixed messages, because half of my face is saying whatever my face is saying, and then half of my face cannot. And imagine like a very deadpan, you walk up to someone at Starbucks, they're the person behind the counter, and they're completely deadpan. And you're like, it can be confusing. So I'm really I am sending mixed messages, and so the world is responding to me in this odd way. It was very weird and challenging. I would say our ability to recognize subtle shifts in facial expression, subtle shifts in body language, subtle shifts in the tempo and of someone's speech or their word choices, little things like this, in addition to how it feels in my body to experience that, all add into this thing called intuition. So one part of me feels like intuition is not magic. It isn't, and also it is. So I don't want to that's a totally different conversation. It's not magic, and it is. It's not magic in the sense that we can coalesce as much information as we have and get a general message from that information. And the more we can hold and gather, the clearer or like more accurate it might be, which is partly why we do embodiment work. So if I have my head and my heart and my gut and my breath and my primal all working together, well then is it likely that I'm going to receive more information and have a clearer understanding of what that might be? I would think yes. And I definitely have had the moment when my intuition has been sharpest, when I have been most grounded and present.
What I'm hearing in a lot of these cases, though, is that while there may be a sensed shift in something, that may not be a conscious recognition, right? We may not be saying, okay, I'm seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting all these things that are happening around me, and I'm processing it kind of subconsciously, and now I'm getting an intuitive ping, versus seeing something and going into my analytical brain and starting to process like logically something that I'm seeing.
But wouldn't those happen almost simultaneously? I think it's important to remember that when we talk about intuition, it doesn't have to be a solo event that happens over the course of any specific amount of time in which I'm having 5 minutes of intuition and now I'm allowed 10 minutes of rational acceptance of what I felt and application to the world. I think what you're talking about kind of beautifully and succinctly is this idea of, I think that's how it goes. You have an intuitive ping, you then start to take in information about your surroundings, and then you start making some decisions about like what it is you're going to do. I think, for example, there was always a sense, I could tell when my mom or my stepdad in particular, I could tell when he was like in a mood. And so I think I would come in and immediately have some sort of sense about that. And then almost immediately thereafter, start making choices about, okay, so like, how am I going to talk? Where am I going to go? So I don't think they need to be separate, but for the purposes of this conversation, recognizing intuition and why it's valuable can be a tool for, it's alerted me to something. And now that alert has allowed me to shine the light of my awareness maybe more fully than I would have otherwise without the alert, so that I can make some decisions. I realize in saying that, that isn't always how it is. It's often how it's been for me. And then I think to myself like, oh, trauma triggers and all of that. So let's not go too far down that.
Right. And so sometimes there's this, kind of, again, you walk into that room and you just know, right? And that's like an external knowing, like you can sense something. One of the things that I've experienced is like the internal knowing. Like I was a vegetarian for 12 years and like eventually my body just started craving something. And so like I couldn't really like place my finger on it, but when I started eating meat again, the first thing that my brain woke up to was like, get a steak. And I had really never had a craving for steak in my life. And the moment that I had my first piece of red meat, I was so energized. I was so alert. I was so alive. And so like, I think my body was trying to tell me something and I didn't know, right? I couldn't know logically what that was, but my body was trying to send me a message and I listened and I responded and I got my steak and it was great, right? Like it definitely like put me back onto a healthier like path emotionally, mentally, physically. And I think that goes back to like sometimes we just know things.
But it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I want you to confirm this, that a lot of that information that you just spoke to was a felt sense.
Yeah,
it wasn't from what I'm hearing, some message kind of running through your head like a ticker tape about like you should eat. It was like a felt sense, and then you did something, and then you got more felt sense. I'm asking.
Yes, that's exactly. It was like I could not logically, rationally explain anything, right? I just knew. I was like, this is what I need right now.
This is a great conversation because there are different ways of experiencing intuitive pings. And what you just described, this sort of felt sense, is the way I feel like I experience it most frequently. But there are, according to when I did this coach training, other ways. So mental energy, sound energy, sight energy, felt energy, lots of different ways. So some people get something that is a little bit more like what we might expect a premonition to be. Some people might start to recognize patterns or, start to notice things. And so there's lots of different ways of experiencing intuition. And it feels like the story you just told was a very felt sense way of experiencing it, which is, again, something I can relate to because it's my natural way. Usually when I have an intuitive ping, I'm like, oh, I feel like something's not quite right or something's a little off. I don't often get like a brief little movie trailer in my mind about like what's going to happen.
But what I find interesting about that list is that some people do, right? Just because that's not how I experience it doesn't mean that that's not how somebody else could experience it. And so that makes me want to go back to something I brought up earlier, which was like this notion or assumption that some people are born with it, right? And I think like I would like to unpack that a little bit more of like what are some of the fallacies of society that has taught us that like some people have intuition and some people don't. And
well, I think some people are born with it in the same way that I would say for some reason, and I don't know why, I have excellent rhythm and body coordination. And lots of people don't. And because of I teach yoga, I teach fitness, I've taught dance. I was a professional dancer. For those of you who don't know, I dance professionally. And I observe people in class all the time having a hard time understanding how to move their body, how to do like right arm, left leg, like walking patterns can be tricky. And it comes very naturally to me. I have no idea why. Now I know that I have taken that natural capability and deepened it through decades of practice in a variety of ways.
So what I'm hearing though is that you had an innate ability, a natural ability that led to a trust in your abilities, and then you honed it over time.
Yes. And so I think that it's probably true for intuition as well. But I wonder sometimes when we think about intuition, especially when we've seen it portrayed in like movies and media or whatnot, if there are certain kinds of intuition. So I suspect honestly that if you're a person who has this sort of like visual, almost premonition-y like intuition, that the world might be like, oh, you're a gifted like intuitive because of this idea of like what intuition might be. So then you think about, oh, but if someone's like, oh, I have this gut feeling, did the world think of it in the same way? So I think when we think of people who are naturally gifted into intuition, I actually think that probably exists. And, I think everyone has the capability of deepening their own capacity. The same is true for being a good lover. And now I imagine most people listening and most people on this planet would like to think, oh, I'm a really great kisser. I'm a really great lover. But the truth is like that isn't true for everyone. I will tell you a quick story. So I just mentioned that I was a professional dancer. I was doing a national tour of a show called Swing, and we were about to go to Japan for approximately 2-month tour of the show in Japan, which we then did, and it was amazing. Tokyo, Yokosuka, Osaka, Nagoya. We visited Kyoto. It was incredible. And but I had gone back to Pittsburgh, which is where I'm originally from, to visit my family before I went to Japan. And I met up with my friends and we went to this like gay bar in Pittsburgh. I think it was called The Holiday, and it was pretty dive bar. But I had been there many times and I liked it. Anyway, I'm there with like this mixed group of people. A few of my friends, one of them was a woman. And the reason I bring it up is she was like, oh, I'm a really great kisser. I'm like, well, and I was like, well, I'm a really great kisser. And they're like, and everyone was like, oh, we're all really great kissers. So we started doing like a kissing competition, like a mouth kissing competition in a dive bar in Pittsburgh, a dive gay bar in Pittsburgh. And a few things happened that I think are notable. Thing number one, most people are not great kissers, and it's also subjective.
I was about to say, yeah. So, you may have gotten feedback over your course of your experiences that you're a great kisser, but that's because you were with people that you had great chemistry with. And these people...
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I got universally positive feedback about my kissing in this moment, so don't discredit how good a kisser I am. But also, I recognize, I was like, of the group of people here, in my experience of them, not everyone I kissed is a great kisser.
For you.
But for me, exactly. So this idea that like, well, maybe some people are just sort of innately more this or innately more that, and then the culture, we might perceive that and be like, oh, well, you have this natural gift, right? So the kissing example, to be like, if good kissing is like a very aggressive like tongue movement, then this woman was a great kisser. That isn't my flavor typically. I want something a little bit more like nuanced, right? But I could perceive it as like, if I like that, to be like, oh, you're a naturally great kisser. That's amazing, right? So it's all about perception. Fun fact about that story, I also got terrible, terrible strep throat on my flight from JFK to Tokyo. It kicked in probably 15 to 30 minutes after takeoff. And I sat on that plane just having the server, like the attendants, bringing me hot tea the whole time. My throat was on fire. I landed in Tokyo, which is an incredible city, but it's gigantic. And I was like, we had like an hour and a half bus ride to our hotel. And I'm like, I need a doctor. And so we landed at the hotel. We got to the hotel. There was a doctor like so nearby. My friend took me. I could not speak anything to them. And the doctor took one look at me, and they gave me, this doctor looked at my mouth. I couldn't speak a word to her, knew exactly what it was, antibiotics. But that's what I got for doing a kissing party in a dive gay bar in Pittsburgh. But I don't regret it because I learned a lot. Especially about perspective.
And how that can translate to intuition and some people having different types of intuitions.
The takeaway is our culture prone to think of a certain kind of intuition as the only kind, and therefore when they recognize it, think that person has an access to it. I think that's right. So if you've ever watched Charmed, and Phoebe, the youngest of the three Charmed sisters, had the gift of premonition. If you think that intuition is a movie that flashes in your head, then if you don't have that, you probably say, well, I'm not intuitive. I think that I am a very intuitive person, and I never experience it like that. It's just never been my experience. I always get this sort of physical gut, center column, sometimes a tightness in my throat or chest feeling. It's never been a movie. So if I think that intuition is a movie that flashes in my head, well, then I might say I'm not intuitive. But the truth is, I am intuitive, and I recognize, but I'm intuitive in a particular way. In the same way that
you've learned over time that there are these different types of intuitions. So,
and I started trusting it, and I started working with it to be like, oh, like I walked into this room with this group of people. I don't feel comfortable here. And the young part of me was like, well, don't create any conflict. So just stay and shut up. And as I started to mature, I'd be like, oh, wait. And I would start to, getting away from there was the right idea. Going over here was the right idea. I feel really good and comfortable here. Maybe I should stay here. I started to trust it more and more and more. And then, of course, I started doing some education in men's work and yoga and shamanism and all this stuff. And you start to realize, oh, there are a variety of ways in which we can be intuitive. And I was experiencing it in my way. I don't see auras. It's not a thing I see. I don't see things that other people see, but that doesn't mean I don't have access to a version of that.
Yeah. I mean, our bodies are wicked smart, right? They have a lot of ways in which they communicate with us and are trying to help us survive in this world. And I think the example of like, your body was signaling to you in different ways of like, hey, it feels more comfortable over here or over there, right? Like that is an intuitive hit. And it, some people may not recognize it as such. So I'm curious about how within men's work, when it comes to men's work, how can we develop the ability to trust this inner knowing when it may not look like what we think of as intuition?
Well, I think we start by recognizing that there are a variety of kinds. And so, in men's work, we do, especially in the lineage in which I'm being trained, we have the 5 instruments of breath, movement, sound, attention, and visualization. And you start to recognize some of the things that like work more for you than others. I've heard many times, and I say this also, visualization has been challenging for me. Some people find it challenging. Some people find it really accessible. So you start by recognizing, there are different ways of experiencing this. And then you bring in a lot of curiosity and you start to wonder, is it present for me? And have I just not been noticing it? Have I been looking in this direction because I thought it was this, but really it's been over here just in a slightly different direction. So that question, I think, is step 2. So I recognize there's a lot of ways to do it. I start to look into my own life for the ways in which I might experience it. And then I start to do practices where I take myself out of my logical, rational brain from time to time and allow myself to feel my experience differently and then see what comes. And I think the more we do that, the more it'll start to reveal ourselves. And so last night in the circle, and maybe you can speak to this, someone mentioned this practice, the physical practice that we did, getting them out of their head in a way that allowed them a different experience. I think men's work is doing a lot of that. So if you try to look for your intuition in a logical, rational way, it is probably going to be hard to find.
Yeah, so I can say that, like, because I am a bodily sensation feeler when it comes to my intuition, there have been times, though, that my intuition has been wrong, and I've found myself trapped in building a narrative, and that's where I start to overthink and overanalyze, because the intuitive hit that I was getting wasn't accurate. So I may have, noticed somebody's shift in behavior and then like actually was wrong about it. And I didn't
Well, wrong about the shift or wrong about what it meant?
Wrong about what it meant.
Exactly. And that's the distinction I want to make, because I think, and I've had this too, like, oh, I had an intuitive ping and it was wrong. No, not necessarily. What might have been wrong were the assumptions that I made based on that intuitive ping, or the story that I created based on that intuitive ping. And sometimes the person, this is usually about another person, the person you say like, oh, is anything up? No, I'm fine. You're like, oh, my intuition was wrong because they said they're fine. When it's like, oh, I've had people be like, I'm fine. And intuitively, I'm like, no, you're not. You don't have to tell me why you're not or how exactly you're not. But something deep in me is like, I know you're not. And typically, now that I've become to trust my intuition more, I will find out that it was right on some level at some point.
I think that's really fascinating. The disconnecting the ping. The ping can be right from the result, or like the information received afterwards, after acting on the intuitive hit. And I think that is new information for me. I haven't really thought about it that way, and it helps me now understand that, like, because I was quote unquote wrong about some of my intuitive hits, they didn't end up being what I was feeling that it was. That like I became to mistrust my intuition.
Right.
Like I would get a ping, and I'm like, well, I can't trust that because I've been wrong about it in the past.
Right. And now you could make the distinction, like, was my intuitive ping wrong, or is my assumption or story based on that ping wrong?
Right.
And that's why I said last night in Circle, one way that I start to distinguish between intuitive pings and something else is the level of detail. So when I start to get like, oh, something's up with that person, they don't love me anymore, they're in love with someone else, they want to, like, I start to get into this like very specific sort of tale, that is usually an indication of, oh, the intuitive ping has now sent me down like fear or trauma trigger into a story that I'm creating. But if it's just, oh, they seemed a little off. It's funny. I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story if you want to hear it.
I do.
So I was at brunch today with my business partner, talking about business.
As one does at a business brunch.
As one does at a business brunch. We also had fluffy eggs, which I love. And I walked into Liz's cafe, and I saw a friend. So I was chatting with him before my business partner arrived. And then it turned out that my very good friend was meeting this other friend. And as soon as I saw him walk up, I was like, something's not right. Something's different. And so he then walked up, said hello to our mutual friend with whom I was speaking, said hello to me. And I was like, is everything okay? And he turned to his friend with whom he was going to have brunch and said, I need to I'd rather go somewhere else. I don't want to have brunch here. Is that okay? And the friend was like, sure. And so I get a quick kiss goodbye. Now, they left, and my intuitive ping, something was up. Now the story was, he's mad at me. And I actually, even though I went about my business, I'm like, oh, I think he's mad at me. And it felt like that because I'm like, I have low self-esteem and, trauma from, so I'm like, oh, he's mad at me now. Like this friend I care about doesn't love me. And it turned out later, through some communication with him, there was something wrong. He did want to leave. It had nothing to do with me. And I had to make the distinction. My intuitive ping was right. My story was based in something else. And we could go on maybe a whole other episode about like why those stories exist. But to distinguish the ping from the story and recognize one can be right and one can be wrong.
Yeah. So for somebody stuck in overanalyzing or creating story narrative, that could lead to being afraid to trust their intuition. So curious, like, what are some of the first steps in reconnecting with it?
You have to get out of your head. We talk about this in men's work all the time. You have to get out of your head. If you are always leading with your head, you're going to be prone to lead with story. That's what the head does. It wants to put words to it. It wants to put structure to it. It wants to put some sort of confine that we're used to, that we're comfortable with, and that we want to, we can wrap our head around. And you have to be willing to swim in waters that have a totally different structure. And so, when you start to speak the language of the heart, of the gut, of the primal, of the body, it isn't the same. And this is why I say in men's work, we're trying to get out of our head and into our body. We don't want to not use our head. Our heads and our logic and our reason are very important, and we absolutely want to rely on them. But in conjunction with all this other stuff. And today, we tend to be so head-oriented and disconnected from everything else. So you want to start trusting your intuition. Can you lean into what it feels like? Now, this is really hard because oftentimes we get a ping in the middle of a situation that matters to us, and we immediately want a solution. So, yeah, you're going to want to, I don't want this person to break up with me, or I don't want this financial situation to crumble, or whatever the thing is, right? And so that's why we practice. You and I are going to go on retreat soon. There's a reason why we separate ourselves from the regular, mundane, everyday life things that we do, so we can step into a place where we can start to listen more deeply. And we deepen and we deepen and we deepen. That's why it's called a practice. We come back to it over and over and over again so that we can get better and better at listening to it. So if any listener, and I've said this with so many things, with acupuncture and yoga and breath work and pain management techniques, if you want it to be instantaneous, I think you're going to be disappointed. And along the way, you can have some really powerful experiences. Again, last night at Circle, one of the men in Circle had a very powerful experience of the practice. And one of them that I think I even said, it sounds like it was a lot of fun. It sounds like it was cool, right? But they're not all going to be that way. And you have to go back, and you have to have the bad practices and the mundane practices and the ones that are sort of medium, and the ones where you're like, I kind of don't want to be here, I'd rather watch TV, and the ones where you're like, I'm really excited, and then it wasn't exactly what I wanted. You have to have all of those things for you to start to, that's what my heart message feels like. Just quick aside for anyone listening, there's a whole science about the magnetic sort of field around our hearts. I'm not an expert in that, but I know that it is a true thing. There is actually some sensing in language around the heart, and I know that it's not going to look like logical storytelling.
Right. And this goes back to, for me, what intuition is. I cannot prove intuition on paper. I cannot write out a mathematical proof for my intuition.
I think that's right.
But that's where I've learned to have a mistrust of it because I can't prove it and I can't prove it to other people. And I think that's where I find comfort in a lot of America. I can only speak about my upbringing in America here, is like we want to prove things on paper. We want the data. We want the hard facts that prove something. Because it gives us logically that something is right.
It gives us a false sense of security. I think that's why we like it. To be like, I've done all these things, and so I can relax in this. But the truth is, there's a lot of unknown. In the Kabbalistic tradition, as I have come to understand it, I studied a little bit, but I've had friends who were like much more into it and steeped in its teachings. But they do this thing called the 1% and the 99%. And the 1% is literally everything that we can see, feel, and touch and experience in our world. And the 99% represents everything else. That to me is a beautiful representation of, from the Kabbalistic perspective, there is so much we cannot understand. So much that like we're not going to be able to see or hold or touch in particular ways, and that we have to connect to in other ways. And so intuition, I think one of those things, if you try to prove it, if you try to make it a geometric proof, then it will likely fall short. It's a little bit like, so this is a queer podcast. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but you're like a young gay boy. Well, okay, let me speak for myself, because you might be a young queer person of any kind, but I was a young gay boy. And you start to like wrestle with this and you say like, oh, I think I'm gay. And someone says, well, how do you know? You've never slept with a woman. And I was like, well, did you need to sleep with a woman to know that you were straight? I was like, there's no proof except something.
I'm just feeling it. Like this is my internal feeling right now that is connecting me to my truth.
Right. So I didn't need to know through experience that I wanted to be with men. I mean, I had a sense that I wanted to be with men before I even understood what sex was. I was like, oh, there was something about the Dukes of Hazzard that I found compelling. Like there was just this sort of this, like, there's something about this that
and
is
it wasn't
like,
Daisy's shorts.
No, although I did love Daisy because Daisy Duke to me feels a little bit like a superhero, which I think Daisy Duke. Okay, now we're talking about the real stuff here on this podcast. Daisy Duke might be the reason why I prefer female superheroes. I just find them like generally more interesting, and all of my favorite superheroes have all been women. So okay, for those of you who are curious, my favorite superhero of all time is Rogue. I absolutely adore her, and I think part of it is because her gifts come at a cost, and it's like fascinating to think about how someone, grapples between these unbelievable abilities and this burden,
the reality of her life,
which feels very human to me. Okay, so we're on a tangent.
No, but I think it brings it back to like, superpowers. Intuition may seem like a superpower to some who may not feel comfortable or are not fully aware that they also have intuition. It just may not be that superpower-esque like intuition that we've seen represented. And
you might also, like the moments where you feel most connected to your intuition, you might discount it as something else. So I think that intuition is not, it's not like I have a tool in my tool belt. I have a hammer in my tool belt and I can always hammer the certain kind of nail with this hammer. I think intuition is, well, with these people that I have more experience with and more knowledge of and more felt, experience with, it might be heightened. And then with a total stranger, it might be its least accurate, right? And so, you and I talked about an experience at my birthday party in the pool. There was a friend of mine, and I immediately sensed something was wrong. I later asked, turned out I was right about that. Was my intuition sharper there because this is a person I'd spent a lot of time with? I think so.
You understand their patterns and you can tell more clearly that something's off. And in that case, it may actually be more conscious. We go back to like, the subconscious and conscious signals that we do receive. I think over time, the more familiarity you have with a subject, right, you can start to bring more conscious awareness to it. And you can identify like, okay, I'm sensing and I know, versus this is just me having a feeling and I still know.
But if I'm the person who wants to just rely entirely on reason and logic, and I want to say that I don't believe intuition exists, I could easily paint that same situation as, oh, but I know this person. You're like, oh, yeah, that's right. I think so. When we think about intuition, how we see it and how the world experiences it, if you want to discount it and frame it as something else, you absolutely can. And I think a lot of people do, and therefore they're cutting themselves off from the possibility of understanding how it works and then deepening it in places that could use growth.
I think there's also the chance too that by starting to see something and bringing that logical brain to it, you can get trapped in analysis paralysis, where instead of acting on that intuitive hit, you are now trapped in your thinking mind, like trying to make sense of it. And that can be preventative in a lot of different situations to decision making. And you can be frozen because you're now not trusting that intuitive hit that would have, if you would have trusted that intuitive hit, you could have like asked a question, you could have like acted on it. But now you're stuck. You're stuck in a pattern of like, okay, I'm going to think about this. I'm going to ruminate on this. And now I'm in analysis paralysis.
Totally. So I think intuition, especially in the beginning, requires curiosity for it to be effective. So if you get an intuitive ping and then you need to predict a story and have that be accurate, chances are it's not going to be totally accurate, and then you're going to have all the fodder you need to say, my intuition doesn't work and I shouldn't trust it, or it doesn't even exist. Whereas I had a ping, as the example I just used, I think something's up. I have no idea why in this moment. What I can do is I can ask a question later and bring some curiosity. Turns out my intuition was right, but I didn't need my story to be right. I needed the ping to bring me to a person and to create a connection so that I could be of support. I didn't need to be like, I have a crystal ball. I suddenly know exactly what's happening. That isn't what intuition needs to do.
You needed the intuition to be right, to then take action, to make a decision, to ask the question.
I needed to trust the sensation of my intuitive ping, or trust the experience. Let me say that differently. For me, it was a sensation. One might need to trust the experience of their intuition in whichever way they might find it, and then bring curiosity to that without attachment to it being a particular thing. And they might need to also allow themselves some time. It is possible that you'll say, I sense something, is anything up? And that person's like, no. But how many times have we had, hey, you know what, actually a few days ago when you asked me that thing and I said no, I actually was upset. It was this, I just wasn't in a place that, I've had that happen to me so many times. So you have to think, oh, my intuition was right. And so when we bring it all back to like men's work and why we would do it, it will help us with that. And I think that queer people have a real access to intuition. Some of it, I think, is because of an ease in flowing along like the energetic gamut. And I think some of it might be, we've had to cultivate kinds of listening and observation. Some might refer to it as hypervigilance, in order to keep ourselves safe. Either way, or both. I think for many it's both. I find that queer people have an access to it that is different. It is so when we recognize it, like it's a gift, even if it was a hard-earned or painfully earned or terrifyingly earned gift. Can we now utilize it consciously to live more fully, more authentically,
more closer to our truths?
Yeah, more truthfully, more lovingly to ourselves and others? And I think the answer to that is yes. And so let this be the beginning of that conversation of taking this and utilizing it in a way that makes us walk through the world with fuller hearts.
Absolutely. And deeper trust. Deeper trust in ourselves that like we can trust ourselves and trust our instincts, trust our intuition, that like we're going to be okay in this world and that we can help others be okay as well.
And we have some tools. So I think a lot of queer people, I'll speak for myself, there was a long time where I felt very unsafe. If I start to develop my intuition, I can actually use it to be like, oh, if I sense something's off, it can be a tool that I use without jumping to conclusions about like, is this a safe place for me? Should I be sharing this right now? Like, it can be a very conscious tool that is powerful and protective.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of what I hear is that there's a lot of these intuitive nudges that you felt over time, and many queer people have felt over time, that has helped to build confidence in that intuition. It wasn't maybe not always there, but I think this is the message to folks, is that it can be built, whether you believe right now that some people are born with it and some people aren't, right? There is the way forward that it can be nurtured. You can have access to this and build it up over time and regain that trust in your senses.
Totally. And I do it every time I teach yoga. So, and it's interesting, I teach a gentle class here in town, and the people will always come in, they'll be like, well, what props do we need? And at this point in my career, I'm like, I don't really know. Like, I'm like, I don't have a plan except like a general sort of, I'm going to give you a gentle mobility yoga class that I'm scheduled to teach. I'm like, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us moving, and then I'm going to feel into and look around and sense the people in the room and get an idea of what is needed in this moment. And when I allow myself to do that, my yoga classes are the best they can be. But it means that like, so it's like, I'm going to trust in my intuition that it's going to come up and it's going to take us wherever we need to go. And so then there's a part of me, for that question to be like, if you need a bolster and you don't have one, I will get one for you. And I do. I'm like, I'll get you. And usually people just grab all the things anyway. I have 2 blocks and a strap and a bolster and a blanket. Great, you're fine. But for me, it's like, I'm going to feel into this experience as it starts, and that's going to inform where we go. And every time I do it, we go somewhere a little different. And I can't tell you how many times I've been like, I had no idea we were going to end up here. I had no idea we were going to do this pose or focus on this thing. And of course, I'm a nerd, so I get really excited about it. But I'll be like, I didn't know we were going to go here, but we are here, and it's great.
And I'm going to say something.
Yeah,
right?
say it.
That
you love my yoga class?
Well, I do love your yoga class. And then somebody might listen to this and who has never taken your yoga class and doesn't know how masterful of a teacher you are.
Oh my God, thank you.
And so they could assume, oh, he's not prepared. But what we actually know is that it took 20 years of preparedness to get to that moment, to be able to trust your instincts in that. It's through all of those, intuition builds off of experience. And so
intuition is a thing you can practice. I will say to that listener who is wondering about my level of preparedness, I would say for at least the first full year of me teaching yoga, I would walk into every class with my sequence entirely written out in a big note, like a school, like middle school, high school kind of like notebook. I would have my music, So the intuition and the intuitive engagement that I bring to my yoga classes now is only possible because of all of that preparation.
Right.
So for someone who wants to develop their own intuition, don't believe that you can just throw all of your practice and preparation out because intuition's going to come at you like a movie trailer in your head. It may not. It may require a lot of work and listening and asking and curiosity and going back over and over and over again. And so the work is a huge part of it. I think one of the reasons I can be intuitive is because I've been steeped in this practice, in doing it, in watching it, in leading it, in adjusting it, and receiving adjustments. Like so much of it, we're like, well, now it's sort of in me. And I think so that is part of intuition in my experience.
Intuition builds off of experience. And the more experience you have with something, the more positive experience, the more confidence you're going to have in it. Right. So it all just builds off of it to be able to trust in it more. Some people are a little bit more trusting in it, and some people require a little bit trust building.
Yeah.
And that it takes time. And I think it all just brings it back. Like, this is called men's work because it is work.
It's work. It's practice. It's work.
Practice. And some of it is going to come more naturally and easier. Some of it is going to be more challenging. But the invitation is like, can you show up? Can you continue to show up? Mm-hmm. And understand that, like, sometimes it's going to be easier for you. Sometimes it's going to be harder. But so sometimes showing up is the hardest part.
I would like to thank you for starting this conversation, because I think the world will be served the more we can all feel into our felt sense and our versions of intuition and try to meet each other with sensitivity and curiosity. And my intuitive ping is that we have covered this topic in this episode. There is obviously conversation after conversation about this, and we'll come back to it. I think it's a huge part of how I live and how I do this work. And I invite every listener to start to, at the very minimum, contemplate how your own natural intuition may show up for you. Do you feel it? Do you see it? Do you hear it? Or some combination thereof. And that's okay.
Absolutely. And continue to bring curiosity to it, curiosity to others. When you notice something, try to just ask the question. I just noticed something. Is everything okay? Don't bring the story. Just trust that you had a ping and now act on it, make a decision on it, rather than trying to think overly about it and overanalyzing and getting stuck in your trap. So with that, I feel very complete.
As do I. Thank you so much for joining us here in the circle. And as we leave now, I wish you brotherhood, connection, authenticity, vulnerability, safety, and love. And with these words, our container is open but not broken. If you'd like to stay connected to us between episodes, please follow us on Instagram at Queer Men's Embodiment. Like, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you find podcasts. We'll see you again soon.